All right, hello everyone. Thanks for tuning into hosting inclusive events as part of the Move United Leadership Conference. My name is Julia Ray and I'm the Programs Director with Move United, formerly Disabled Sports USA. We would like to thank the Bob Woodruff Foundation for their long-standing commitment and support, allowing us to bring you this virtual opportunity. For those who missed any of the previous sessions, recordings can be found on the conference webpage, which will be the same webpage you used to RSVP for this session. Also on Move United's YouTube channel, so check us out there. Before turning the show over to Kelly and inviting her to speak today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be on mute to minimize distractions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for Kelly today rather than the chat. But do feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and make sure to send your chat message to all panelists and attendees to introduce yourself to the whole group. Just a note about the closed captioning today. We are funneling that into your screen live. So if you see a few mistakes, bear with us and just check your settings and make sure that's enabled if you're looking for closed caption today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our fantastic partner. Move United is really honored to partner with the National Center for Health, Physical Activity and Disability on all kinds of projects. And Kelly's got some great information to share with us today. So thanks, Kelly, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you guys joining us today on a Friday afternoon. I think Move United was really smart to make these half-hour sessions right after lunch. So I promise to keep to that. I'll present today and then we'll have some time afterwards for some quick Q&A. So if I don't get to your Q&A in the middle of the presentation, we'll get to it right after it, I promise. But it's a quick time to get some slides in. So first today we're gonna talk about hosting inclusive events. Oh, and please let me describe myself for all of you. My name is Kelly Bonner. I am the Associate Director of NCHPAD, and today I have semi-straight hair, pulled back in ponytail with glasses, and I'm wearing a blue jacket that says Lakeshore on it. So we'll start with our slides today. We really get this question a lot, hosting inclusive events. How do you do it? Folks from all different walks of life and areas ask us this question, and so we really found that there were a few resources covering everything. So of course there's ADA and ADA guidelines, and that is absolutely where everyone should start and make sure that they're hitting those standards. But we put together a little resource, and we'll reference that afterwards, where all of this information is coming from, that really talks about the rest, how to really do it inclusively and go beyond just what that ADA standard is. Next slide, please. So our definition is, when you're hosting an event, the goal should be to foster an environment that provides full participation and equitable experiences for all attendees. So as I'm going through our list today, know that that's what our aim is. It's so that everyone, when they're in an environment, regardless of what that environment looks like, that they're able to participate to whatever degree they want to. Next slide. Thank you. Go back one. So there you go. So for many that work in this space, you may think that this is a no-brainer, really, that of course you would host an inclusive event. But let me say that after 20 years in the field, I found that I never really stopped learning, and that few places, if any, have ever done a perfect job. So usually there's room to improve. So we're not saying that we don't aim to host an inclusive event. It just might not always happen, or that things are always evolving and new resources become available to us. So with that in mind, I think you can summarize really how to host an inclusive event with these two main points. Next slide. So the first main point I would say is, what is your definition of inclusion? So can you play this video?
Inclusion is when I'm presumed competent.
When I'm recruited as a valued member of my community.
When I'm recruited and welcomed as a valued member of my community.
When I fully participate and learn with my peers.
When I experience genuine social relationships.
Are you inclusive?
Are you inclusive?
Are you inclusive?
Thanks. Perfect. Stay right there. So inclusion is when people with disabilities are presumed competent. That definition you just heard has 3 phrases to it. And the first one was presumed competent. So what that means in an event space is that they could have any job in the house. They could serve on any role. And so therefore they need to have access, full access to everything and everywhere, whether that's backstage, maybe that's the sound booth, whatever that might look like. We want to assume that anyone could have access to every location at the event. The second concept was that they are able to learn and fully participate with their peers. And so this really means that they aren't asked to sit in their own section, right? As someone who's married to someone with a disability, I know that space very, very well. And that they only delivery isn't visual, so that the materials that are sent ahead of time might be able to be processed, or however they're going to engage in the space isn't just a visual engagement, and that they're able to do so in other ways. And then the third one is that they are recruited and valued. So we want them to be a part of the discussion, and we really value what they have to say, right? They're an equal member of whatever the event is taking on. But not only that, but we value who they are and what their disability is. So we don't try to make them fit into our world, but we really try to make the world accessible to all. So the term that a lot of folks use is ableistic, right? So we're really trying not to be ableistic, and we don't say, oh, you're strong enough to, hop up into that 15-passenger van that's not accessible, that's the free shuttle to the airport, instead of saying, let me find another accommodation that's more accessible. And so really valuing them and understanding who they are and taking it to heart. So depending on what your definition of inclusion is really going to define what your event looks like. If you have those 3 key areas in your definition of inclusion, then how that event is going to take place might look really different than if your definition of inclusion was a little different. Next slide. So I love this quote. But it says, inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into the systems and structures which exist in our societies. It is about transforming those systems and structures to make it better for everyone. Inclusion is about creating a better world for everyone. So I really feel like this statement perfectly describes that. It's not about us trying to make them fit into the event that as we want to present it, but it's about us changing our event so that it fits everyone equally. Next slide. So the second point is really to partner with people with disability. So again, you may think, hey, I've been doing this forever, I've got it covered. Just because I don't have a disability doesn't mean that I don't know how to cover this space. And I would just offer a word of advice as someone that's worked in this world of disability for over 20 years, and I've been married to my husband for over 10 years. Still to this day, I will put the dishes away and think, oh, for sure he can reach that. I know he can reach that. And then it never fails. I'll be like changing a diaper or whatever the most inconvenient circumstance is, and I'll be like, hey, I can't reach those bowls that you put there. So let's just all admit, if we don't have that disability, we might not get it right 100% of the time, right? And so that's why we have to make sure that we're including people with disabilities in the planning process from the very beginning. Not only that is to make sure that all disabilities are covered. So just because one disability might be represented on your committee or your planning process doesn't cover all the disability types. Again, they can't speak for another disability type. So you want to make sure that you're forming these strategic partnerships. So you want to form an inclusive event committee, make sure that all varying disabilities are there, or you bring everyone to the table. And to do so, you might need to reach out to some disability organizations. And we often get the question like, who or how do we reach these people with disabilities? How do we make sure that we have the right people at our table? So on the right, you can see some suggestions of organizations that you might want to reach out to if they are organizations that represent different disabilities than you're used to serving. So one could be a Centers for Independent Living. You could also reach out to local awareness groups like the Autism Network. You could do the Institute for the Deaf and Blind and Special Olympics. Next slide. Okay, so the key items, once you have those two in place, I think everything else will really fall into place. But these are kind of the key items for inclusive best practices when you're hosting an inclusive event. So each of these areas will require specific details. So we're going to look at each of them briefly, but we call them core competencies, registration, marketing, the venue you're hosting, and then the event itself. Next slide. So the core competencies, this is something I like to refer to as just what everybody has to have, the basics. So this falls back to that definition of inclusion and includes things like language or tips for interactions. And I won't go through all of it today, but I will say that in our event guide that we've put together, there's a whole lot more information than this. But I'll just read this slide to you as it says, as host, you must ensure that you are addressing inclusion in all areas, including the knowledge and education of your staff. All staff, regardless of whether they will have direct or indirect contact with these attendees, should have a solid foundation of inclusive practices and respectful interactions. Next slide. So one of the first ways that we would say that is disability education or effective communication. And this is really one of the primary building blocks to inclusion. And so right now, in the disability movement, there's two acceptable terms. And I would say that all of your staff, regardless of who they are, need to know what these acceptable terms are to refer to someone. So the first would be person first terminology, putting the person before their diagnosis and describing the person. It's really seen as a type of disability etiquette. And then on the other end is identity first. And this really comes from a self-advocacy movement and a culture of shared experience. And it gives the advocate of identity first really power in who they are. And so both of those are acceptable terms in referring to someone, but there's definitely phrases you wouldn't want to use. Next slide. So regardless of whether you use person first language or identity first language, you always want to make sure that all of your staff, regardless, use positive language and avoid negative language. And so you can see on the screen, words to avoid would be like crippled, wheelchair bound or confined, handicapped, challenged, victim of or suffers from, and then anything that ends in IC. But words you can say as someone who uses a wheelchair, or someone who has a disability, or they've had a stroke, or they've experienced a stroke, or is disabled. So all of those are acceptable terms. And when any of your, even if it's just the first person they reach on the phone, and when they say it wrong, that can really have a huge impact on the rest of your event. And so making sure that everyone on your team knows how to use that language is going to be really important. Next slide. I see we're getting close in time, so we're going to hurry. All right, in marketing, we want to have some effective communication. Obviously is vital when we're talking about marketing, and without those proper descriptions or images and text, really the campaign might be futile because it's not going to get to the communities that you want it to. So this is your first impression that you're able to give to your audience, and you want to make sure that all individuals are feeling invited and welcomed at your event. So these inclusive marketing materials are going to be a great first impression. So the first is 1 in 4 messages should be inclusive. That means have some type of inclusive imagery, use inclusive language, anything around those lines to make sure that they know that everyone is invited to the table. Multiple forms of delivery, so don't just use social media. What if someone doesn't have the ability to access social media? You want to make sure that you're delivering it in other forms. Use the sans serif font. So serif fonts are the curly ones. They're harder to read, and they're just not easy to be picked up, and especially by some screen readers. And which leads into the next one. If a PDF, check for screen reader accessibility, which is built into most computer systems now. Avoid busy backgrounds or any text over imaging. Use large print, and then list what accommodations are going to be provided. This goes a long way to let them know that you are thinking about them. And so if they already see it listed out, they're going to feel a lot more confident to come into your space than if they didn't, and they know they're going to have to ask for everything. And then providing alternative formats. Next slide. Registration is the same as marketing, and really just making sure that you have effective communication. So the registration process and any associated paperwork can be really telling of your organization's readiness to serve these individuals. And so it's important to be clear and specific about any accommodations that you're going to be providing or that can be requested. And the more information you deliver up front, the more confident those individuals are going to feel of the services you've provided. So after you state what you provided, then you could ask what other accommodations might be needed, something that you might have not have thought of. So your registration should identify the access that you're already providing. It should ask what accommodations are needed. You should be clear about any areas or points that might provide less access, like put in there, if there's no control over it, hey, the bathrooms are really about, 20 feet away or however far away, and let folks know that there's only one exit door to this building if they have PTSD or something like that. And so you want to be really clear about what you're providing. Provide clear, accessible directions all the way down to the smallest detail as to maybe even what room number it is, so that they know whether there's accessible transportation to your facility and how to get through there. And then provide staff to assist. Next slide. Venues are really creating an inclusive event means that you're creating an event that is free of barriers, engaging for the broadest audience, and goes beyond the ADA compliance to universal design. Next slide, let's talk about the universal design a little bit. So sometimes you don't get a lot of say, right, in the space that you're choosing or for your venue. But if you do, you really want to look at what universal design aspects you can implement there. So while the ADA sets those requirements for accessibility, that's really a minimum level of access. And so universal design really incorporates or ensures that an environment or product can be used by as many people as possible at many different ability levels, and that it's safe and that it's going beyond the law. Next slide. So when you're selecting that venue, you want to think about two specific things, and one is navigating that space, and second is engaging that space. So navigating the space would include things like your parking, transportation, does public transportation go there, clear signage, options for seating, easy and equal access to restrooms, and then an accessible stage, anywhere else that might be there. And then engaging in the space is more than just a visual engagement. It's things like always using a microphone and never asking oh, can everybody hear me? Because that just wouldn't be acceptable. And then providing accessible whiteboards, refreshments, meeting tables, all of that. So navigating the space versus engaging the space. Next slide. So the types of event can really vary, but no matter what the event is, ask the question, can everyone engage in this event equally? It's not about accessing an event, it's about engaging in the space. So is everything in the space visually able to be seen? Is there more than just a visual presence? What are the lines of sight? What does the space look like for someone who has autism? Is it too tight? So really think, you remember to keep partner with disabilities and don't assume, and then ask if it's truly equal. This is one of my favorite pictures. I'll describe it really quick. We were at a track meet, and I won't say where in case anybody's on this presentation right now, but this was the only bathroom for our track meet, and obviously it's up a flight of stairs, so I had to carry those girls up there. And then the best part was this accessible sign at the top of the stairs. So there might have been an accessible restroom in there, but was it really accessible? No, because we couldn't get there. And so thinking about that venue, that's not equal space, and we're not really thinking through everyone together. And so when you're thinking of your types of events and you're looking at your staff, you want to make sure that to the smallest detail, for us on our campus, we have so many people on our campus. And to me, it's just like a stab in the heart if someone who's using our event walks into the restrooms and they run into a staff member in the accessible stall or another participant in the accessible stall when they didn't need it. And it's like, goes back to that definition of inclusion and what does that mean? And so making sure that wherever you look, all over the event, that everyone is trained at an equal level to know and respect everyone else who's also attending that event. Next slide. So this is the guide that I was talking about. So there's obviously a ton of more information in it. 20 minutes is not a long time to go through it. So this will be the site, how to get to this link will be listed with Move United, and they'll have it. I'm going to get to some questions really quick. So the first question says, hey, I didn't know epileptic or diabetic were terms to avoid. I thought they were a medical diagnosis and so appropriate. I would love to learn so I would avoid using them. Yeah, so we really say to avoid any IC word. And I'll tell you, coming from me, it was one of the hardest things for me to learn. I came from a sport world, a disability sport world, which may be just in and of itself oftentimes a little bit more ableistic than the disability movement. And so to refer to my husband, it was always a paraplegic. but when I started working at NCHPAD, it was like they would like hold signs up when I would give presentations and say, "Stop saying that." So yeah, you never want to refer to that, but more of the person. And again, allow them that confidence. If someone refers to themselves that way, that's fine. But otherwise, you would want to use person first language in that instance if you could. Oh, is this in comparison to has epilepsy or has diabetes? That makes sense. Okay, you got it. Sorry, could have read this both together. If someone is not by definition physically disabled but has mobility concerns, what is the best language to use? I guess it would matter or what instance you're doing it. Like if you're doing it in your event guide and you're providing registration information, like, do you have mobility concerns? I think you could just say that. I don't think you have to say a disability. Why call it out? You know, did you have, anyone could have a mobility limitation. And so that's typically how we would say it, is a mobility limitation, or they just can request an accommodation. So I think you could do either of those and they would be acceptable. You don't have to call out the disability for someone to require accommodation. Next question says, are marketing and registration accommodations listed on NCHPAD site? So in this guide that I just referenced, we list, there's like pages on marketing and pages on registration, and we talk about all the accommodations that might be. There's even some sample wording, like how you might want to word your registration. If you were to say, you know, this and this is provided, what other accommodations, you could either leave it as a blank, like what other accommodations are needed, or the other option would be to list out all the accommodations you're ready to provide. I would just say, you know, if once you're ready to provide those, the more advanced you need to do it so that you are prepared to offer whatever accommodations are needed. Like if you needed someone to provide interpreting, you know, you're going to have to do that ahead of time. Next question says, do you use easy to read format? Yes, absolutely. The ADA recommends, so obviously all of this is kind of above the ADA standard, but if you're looking at ADA recommendations, it would be an 8th grade reading level or lower to make sure that anybody can understand it. That is very important. Next question says, with the COVID-19 pandemic forcing many conferences and events moving online, what are a few accessibility tips or things we need to consider about when hosting virtual events? I've picked up a few things throughout the week, but would appreciate any specific advice you can provide. Yeah, making sure it's not a visual engagement only. So making sure the presenters are describing themselves, describing their slides, making sure that closed captioning is provided. There's a couple different options to do that. We have found today that it's harder than you may think, so to be prepared with that ahead of time, but then also think about what other costs you might incur if you do have someone who's signing during your presentation that might be required, or even providing professional closed captioning that might be an extra expense. And so just thinking about what other little things you need to consider to make sure it's not just a visual experience and providing the accessibility that you need. Moving on to the next one. Let me see. Can you please provide the link to the guide? So I've sent it to Move United and they have it, and I believe that they'll be sending it out with their guide. If you go to NCHPAD's website, which is posted up there, and you just type in Discover Inclusive Events, it'll pop up as well. So you can go to ncpad.org and it'll pop up as well.
It's just posted in the chat as well, Kelly.
Oh, and it's posted in the chat. All right. Looks like we have about 4 more minutes. Does anyone else have any questions?
All right, I think, well, as we wait and see if there's any more questions, Kelly, I didn't know, I read an interesting article from the BBC yesterday about kind of our post-COVID world and whether it would become more inclusive as we think about ways to avoid touching doors to open them. So maybe there's more automation, or having wider aisles in the grocery store. And I don't know if you've been thinking about that too, or wanted to share any thoughts with us.
Yeah, well, we've definitely been reading all the articles that have been coming out on it. They've, you know, the first ones have really come out of China, obviously, where it was first affected, and just seeing a disproportionate rate of effect in just virtual work. and being able to still perform their jobs with the needed accommodations. Here in the United States, I think it's an accommodation that folks with a disability have been asking for a really long time to be able to work from home. And so I think we're seeing how effective it can be with the right accommodations, and usually those are pretty cheap and pretty easy. Microsoft Office actually does a great job at making most of their work accessible, and if you don't know that, you can YouTube some videos on it. So I think it's going to be interesting. We did a survey just to kind of see where people are at with disability and with the COVID crisis, and I think those results will come out soon. But I think we are going to see that an inclusive world really is a better world, what we knew all along, right? And so those wider aisles are going to make everybody happier, and we don't have to worry about it in specific times. One more question I see here. I'm currently trying to provide a way to include closed captioning for my Zoom programs. If you could guide me to the resource you use to make closed captioning possible, that would be great. Sorry, pause 1 second as my child is yelling in the other room. Let me get Grandmama to get my child. I'm so sorry. She's probably going to come out.
I can speak to the Zoom if you'd like.
Yeah, and Zoom offers closed captioning in it, but you can hire someone professional to do it. And if not, you can, right now, Kayla's doing it for us. So there's some different options, but I will let you answer since it's getting a little loud in my house.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks so much, Kelly, and it's lovely to see your kids on screen too. But yeah, we have been typing in the closed captioning live, so forgive those mistakes. You can also follow up with the recording on YouTube, and you can enable closed captions that way as well. As Kelly mentioned in the presentation, there are some professional services you can employ with that. There are also ways to turn on closed captioning in an automatic way through Google Slides, and the more current versions of PowerPoint offer that as well. So there's a few different ways it can be accomplished. Some other streaming services like Teams also offer automated closed captioning as well.
Thank you. I see there's a couple more questions that came in. It says, do you have any tips for educating coworkers who don't have as much education understanding in this realm? I would definitely suggest some disability education work. So we have a free disability education webinar on our e-learning site that anybody is welcome to access, that it just provides some basic information on how this impacts their world. We have a couple videos on disability and the workforce and what that means for your employer and your employees. So I think there's definitely resources out there. We're definitely not the only ones that put out resources like that. So I would definitely just search some disability education pieces and even specific to the workforce, and you could find some. The next question states, what is your experience like as a non-disabled professional working within the disability movement? I'm sure there have been some lessons along the way. Are there any key things you'd say non-disabled people should be sensitive to in that field? Yeah, gosh, so many. I think I live in a unique space because of my husband. So sometimes I can speak to stuff that our family experiences, but I still am not a person with a disability, and I'm always only an ally and never in that space. And so I think the first thing is to respect who those are and what their disability is, and that we don't know it. And so I would always say, you know, whenever possible, if someone with a disability has a role that could be filled, they need to be filling it. And we shouldn't, as non-disabled people, be trying to fill those spots. So I think that's probably a big question that I could answer for all day, but I won't since we have 1 minute left. But yes, I think definitely we need to be very aware of the space that we're in as non-disabled people working in the disabled movement. What closed captioning was been using in the EEE section? I don't know what that was. I'm sorry, someone from Move United might be able to answer that one.
We'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay. Last question says, I struggle with overcoming old buildings not suited for inclusivity. What strategies can be employed? Oh, so hard and such an everyday experience. So they're not ADA compliant, which is hard. Nobody really wants to take that federal route of filing a federal suit. Like if you have to use the building, make it as accessible as possible by making, you know, if there's a back entrance or something, then that becomes the entrance for everybody. If it's the one that only someone who uses a wheelchair could enter, then everybody goes through there. but anytime it's possible to show or make minor improvements is great. And then I've always found that educating is best, so we don't want to go in with that be, the threat of a lawsuit, but just to say, hey, did you happen to know I can't get in here? There's plenty of restaurants in our town that are like that. And so educating the owners usually is the best thing, and saying, hey, there might be some tax credits for you if you make this successful. By the way, you're not in compliance. But usually it's a hard battle, and some, find it hard to prove the use of needing a ramp or something like that. It's unfortunate.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
Kelly, I think we are at time. So sorry, I know there's like probably 1,000 more questions that people want to ask you, and I'm sure they can maybe reach you through NCHPAD and follow up that way. Also, make sure that you complete the survey after this session, and also give a shout out if you like the session using #MoveUnited on social. So thanks for joining us, everyone. We really appreciate it. Tune in for our closing keynote, as well as our next session, the volunteer leader.